welcome to the Governance Update. We bring it to you every week from VLGA Connect with our thanks to Hunt & Hunt lawyers. And here's Stephen Cooper. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Chris. How are you?
Going very well, thank you. Good to see you again.
Absolute pleasure. And I mean, great day today, Chris, after what I would have said was almost the best AGM ever last night, and well done to you on your chairing skills.
Oh, thank you. Just a small role that I had to play in the VLGA AGM, which, you know, kudos to Catherine in particular, the CEO, for rethinking how to do an AGM in a COVID era. And I've received some great feedback for how it went. And I've got to say, you know, how do you pick the good bits of that going forward and retain it as we return to face-to-face type events?
I don't know how you do that, Chris, but I do know that if members keep an eye on their e-news, there will be some information posted with some links to highlights of the AGM, I'm sure.
And it's worth checking out if you weren't able to be there. Peggy O'Neill was our guest speaker, Peggy O'Neill AO, of course, who's just been announced as the Melburnian of the year and has a string of great credits to her name. And I thought she was inspirational.
Hot on the heels of her appointment as Chancellor of RMIT, Chris. And look, we could spend a bit of time just talking about the highlights of Peggy's address, but I really loved where she started, basically saying that governance and culture are two sides of the same coin.
And I just love the story of the Girl Scouts when she was in, I asked her what her first leadership role was, and it was leading a Girl Scout troop and imposing fines when they didn't wear their uniforms properly, etc. And a lawyer and a leader was born.
A slightly gendered comment, but I can only think of what Michael Apted said in his 7 Up series, show me the child at 7 and I'll show you the man.
There you go. Since we last spoke, Steve, a string of mayoral elections have been conducted around Victoria. I don't propose to go through the whole list, but I will do that on the Local Government News Roundup podcast.
But you must have some highlights, Chris, or some notable ones that you'd like to mention.
I do. Just a couple that jump out at me. Brimbank, I'd like to mention. Jasmine Nguyen is the new mayor of Brimbank, and that's notable. First Vietnamese and youngest mayor ever at Brimbank. And, you know, neighbouring council Maribyrnong has elected a Vietnamese mayor at the age of 22 in Anthony Tran. I think it's a lovely trend through the West that's happening, which notes the rich fabric of those communities.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And I've been lucky enough to do some work with Jasmine over the last 12 months, and congratulations to her and to Brimbank.
And on that note, the other one I wanted to single out was Laura Binks at Strathbogie, who I remember distinctly as a participant in our VLGA pre-election candidate forums, and one of those people that was asking really, really good questions, not just at the session, but in follow-up. And here we are in the second year of the first term, and Laura's been elevated to the mayoralty at Strathbogie.
Yeah, and that's a council where the council as a group have really made a commitment to working on their governance. So good luck to Laura and the council in that project.
So lots of results, and I've been keeping track of these on the website, as people may know. We've got a real mix of first-term or first-time mayors, experienced mayors coming back into the role. I haven't done the numbers yet, but it feels like we might have more female mayors when the totalling is done, Steve, which is a good trend to match the increase in female representation across the board. The deputy mayor is an interesting one. I just wanted to make note of. A few councils have debated whether or not to have a deputy mayor. There's about 5, I think, that have chosen not to, and the latest is Horsham as of last night, where Robin Gilleen was re-elected to mayor for a second term, but they chose not to have a deputy mayor. But I wanted to note that some of the interesting discussions that are being had, Steve, about this. One of the positions appears to be, and logically so, why do you need a deputy? All the other councillors should be supporting the mayor in their role, and therefore, you know, they're a team of deputies. But one theme that's come through is this concern that when the new tribunal ruling, the Independent Remuneration Tribunal makes a ruling, that there seems to be a fear that they're going to set a specific allowance for deputy mayor above that of the rest of the councillors. And some are worried about the precedent or the trend that would be set by that. Have you picked up on any of that yourself?
I hadn't heard that one in particular, Chris. And if we go back, there's been a rich history of deputy mayors and the way that it's been referenced in various local government acts over the last 15 years or so. So certainly from time to time there have been councils that have decided not to, and often for that cultural reason that you talk about, that we should all step up. I've got to say, I sort of think if a council does have a deputy mayor and that role entails a bit more work, then maybe it's deserving of a slightly higher allowance. But I'd be inclined to wait to see what the tribunal says.
Now, we're expecting a ruling from the tribunal, I think, before the end of the calendar year, aren't we? So it must be imminent.
I believe so. I wouldn't be saying in the next few weeks. I know the tribunal's been consulting with a range of stakeholder bodies, including the VLGA, and if I can put it simply, and our submission's been quite public, we've said two things about it, Chris. One is that that if the allowance is inadequate, that's a barrier of entry for many people who might otherwise be councillors, and you know, we should be encouraging diversity, not just those who can afford to have the role. And that's really consistent with the report that was done about 12 years ago. And the other part that we've really submitted on is that the role of councillor is more complex. Strategic, principles-based role under the 2020 Act, the quite clear problem-solving and conflict resolution skills required of the role really require that the allowance reflect that.
And just playing devil's advocate here, the Act still does call it an allowance, doesn't it, as opposed to it being a salary?
It's not a salary, Chris. No, you're quite right. It's an allowance intended to defray the costs associated with the office of councillor, and those costs that are not, I suppose, duties of the councillor, as would be reimbursed under the expenses policy.
The other thing that I noted that I thought was interesting, and I'm not sure too many do this, but I'm prepared to be corrected. One council resolved to deduct $200 a month from the mayoral allowance to defray the costs of operating a mayoral vehicle. I hadn't heard that one before. Have you?
No, I hadn't either, Chris. I presume they've had advice, and I must admit I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it about 2 minutes before we started recording. I mean, I know there have been councils that have resolved to for their council allowance to go back a level, and people will make their own judgment on that, but I'd ask them to consider what I just said before. So, I mean, that's an interesting one. Is all I can say.
And it was a rural council, and we all know that rurals obviously have more challenges from a financial perspective.
Yeah, and let's be clear, there is a sensitivity amongst the public around the level of those allowances and the extent to which there should be, I guess, volunteer effort, if you like, or versus, you know, what should be the payment for that effort made.
And $200 a month or $50 a week is not massive by any means, but it was an interesting principle, I thought, that was being...
Well, yeah, isn't it the case, Chris? It's more about the principle than any kind of material impact on the bottom line at the end of the year.
Now, we have to correct a grave injustice. Last week, about what's going to happen at Yarra Ranges Shire, and we were waiting for details of a countback. We'll be waiting forever.
This is addendum and erratum, Chris. I think we file this under "we were wrong." I had completely missed until my colleague Deborah Wu pointed it out to me that, of course, they've got single-member wards at Yarra Ranges, and that would necessitate a by-election, not a countback.
Yes, we should have realised that, but we're still new to this single-member ward being quite so prevalent, and it's going to be more so. So I guess in future we can expect when there's resignations there to be more by-elections than countbacks.
I would imagine so. I hope viewers and listeners are sort of sensing our contrition on this particular point, Chris.
I'm sure they'll forgive us. The gazettal notice has been done this week, and the by-election will happen by postal vote, of course, in February, 19th of February. So a bit of time to go till that position is filled at Yarra Ranges. There is a countback coming up, though, Steve.
Whereabouts, Chris? You're about to tell me.
Moira Shire Council will have a countback because long-standing councillor Kevin Burke tendered his resignation last week following the mayoral election after nearly 10 years on the council. So the VEC's confirmed that a countback will be needed there, and that will happen on the 14th of December at 10 a.m.
Yeah, because, of course, being a rural council, therein lies a sort of an exemption to the general single councillor ward rule, I suppose, Chris.
Yes, and of course it depends on when the electoral representation reviews happen. And my understanding is that single member wards is the default position unless there's an argument, particularly in the case of small rurals, for why that shouldn't be the case. Now, I know you've spent a bit of time at one of these sessions this week, as have I. The LG Pro Infrastructure and Transport Summit is worth a mention. What a great initiative from LG Pro to fill a void that's been left by the National Roads Congress, which hasn't been run now, I think, for a couple of years because of COVID.
No, and in fact, I think you went to a circular economy session, Chris, and I sat in for a bit over an hour on a smart cities session yesterday. And like you, congratulations to LG Pro on putting that event together, and what a good format.
Yes, so 6 sessions of 2 hours over 3 weeks. So there's another 2 next week and another 2 the week after on a range of topics relating to really those big picture infrastructure transport issues, which are very challenging and topical for councils.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things out of that, Chris. The first is that there's still time for people to get onto the LG Pro website and register for that. The second is that you can tell me all about Councillor James.
Yes, so you sent me a note saying when we talk about the summit, I'd like to talk about Councillor James and the finest cricket book ever written. Are you talking about Stuart James from Monash?
Well, no, I mean, that's an opportunity to actually congratulate Councillor Stuart James on his re-election to the position of Mayor, and he has been a VLGA Connect guest and a friend of the VLGA. So, of course, we congratulate Stuart James. But no, it was an opportunity for me to point to, in fact, what I believe is purportedly the finest cricket book ever written, called Beyond a Boundary by C.L.R. James.
Oh, C.L.R. James. Here I was. See, my brain just goes to council law.
Now, there's a couple of directions. I want to come back to purportedly. So can I deal with something first and then I'll come back to purportedly and a weird stat? Yes. In the introduction to Beyond a Boundary, James he quotes Rudyard Kipling, who said, "How can he know England who only England knows?" James has sort of paraphrased that and said, "How can he know cricket who only cricket knows?" And I guess the point for me on that, and let me just say it is a cracking book, by the way, in fact, published in 1963. So anyone who's interested, it is worth a read because of the social commentary that goes alongside the cricket. But I was really thinking about that in the context of the LG Pro session, that sometimes in local government, if we run a session for council planners or about council planning, we just get all the council planners there, but maybe people from other disciplines should go. And it was a reminder with the LG Pro session about infrastructure planning, how, particularly in the context of asset planning, maybe we should just get out of our lanes a bit.
I did so wonder how you were going to tie all that together. You must lay awake at night thinking, how can I get cricket into the governance discussion? I've done everything else. Well, kudos to you. You've managed it again.
Thank you. And we'll leave the Yorkshire County Cricket Club alone this week, but there have been developments, let me say, Chris, over the last week.
Oh, I can't wait to hear.
Purportedly
developments this week.
The thing I didn't quite lay awake wondering was, it reminded me, I was wondering how many times has the word purportedly appeared in the 2020 Act, because I always loved the fact that in the 1989 Act there was this beautiful phrase, and all the governance nerds will know this, that when you made a new local law, you had to advertise the purpose and general purport of the local law. And I was pleased when I did a word search. The word purported doesn't appear in the 2020 Act, but there is about a dozen references to purporting in relation to things like CEO, attestations, and what ballot papers look like and things like that. So the tradition continues, Chris.
Very good. There's your word count for purported for the new Act. Now, people may not be aware of this, but it is International Fraud Awareness Week, which suggests there needs to be one if people aren't aware.
Yeah, a bit of a pity. We're sort of back to where Peggy started around the topic of culture and governance being intertwined, and obviously a lot of frauds, start as small things. So it's sort of a reminder again to pay attention to culture, but. IBAC in particular have published quite a bit of really useful information, Chris. So even just searching the IBAC account on your Twitter feed, I did pick up on a rather excellent checklist for organisations in terms of their fraud awareness. So anyone in leadership, or actually people maybe who you know, Chris, on audit and risk committees might find that a useful bit of reading.
Absolutely. Good tip. Now, we've had a bit of mail on, particularly on LinkedIn, in regards to a recent episode we did where we talked about conflict of interest. I know you wanted to pick up on some of those themes that came from that discussion.
Yeah, Chris, Lou Curry actually asked some cracking questions, and I'm just trying to find them here, around that topic of conflict of interest, and there was a lovely bit of banter between Lou and Tony Roundich of Hunt and Hunt on the questions of where should decision makers get advice, and should we have registers of conflict of interest. So I just thought it was worthwhile coming back to after a couple of weeks.
Sure. So what was the main thrust of that discussion then?
Lou's sort of question was initially around, do we need more training or independent advice for decision makers? And I suppose you would, I am presuming you would agree with me, Chris, that you really need to talk about conflict of interest on a regular basis, because we know that people can be blindsided. And interesting that this week there's been a vote of no confidence in the South Australian Parliament in relation to the Attorney General.
Yes, and Deputy Premier with, and I think that inquiry has found they believe there was a conflict of interest that wasn't declared.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a few things that sort of fall out of that. So Lou sort of mentioned about, do we need a system capturing declarations and integrating it with decision-making processes, or, in a sense saying, should there be a register where conflicts of interest are declared up front? And I always tend to think that's difficult to do, because there are some conflicts of interest that are just potential or might seem to be immaterial, and then it's at the point where something happens that all of the information can be integrated. You might have received a modest gift from, a family member, and then at some point later on, that family member becomes a party to a decision of the council. So what was immaterial and remote becomes material. It's only at the point where I think the decision is made that a determination about the sort of materiality of the conflict could be actually recorded, Chris.
There's a couple of interesting threads in that comment too about the capacity of people to put their personal interests aside when they make decisions, and we all think, well, we can do that. We're pretty clear-minded, rational people. I had a conversation with someone about this in a mentoring session very recently, but it's dangerous to think that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And we touched on this a couple of weeks ago. I think the former Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, may have, without preempting the decision of ICAC, but certainly made some comments in the ICAC hearing that I always put the interests of the community first. I wouldn't let my decision be swayed by that conflict of interest or that apparent conflict of interest. And in the cold, hard light of day, that sort of rationale doesn't cut the mustard. That, in fact, even that there is a perception of a conflict, whether it influences your decision or not, is the sort of the primary point, I suppose, Chris.
Yeah. And what about the suggestion of mandatory reporting of potential breaches of conflict of interest provisions?
I think that's worth a look. I know that, well, hang on, no, I don't know. I suspect that the IBAC Casey report will go into some detail, the Operation Sandon report will go into some detail or address this obligation, or what obligation there might be for CEOs or others who become aware of potential breaches, including conflicts of interest, to say something about that. There are provisions in the misconduct provisions, I suppose, of the Local Government Act around the fact that it is the role of the inspectorate to report conflicts of interest. I've heard sort of anecdotal reports of perhaps in the less functional councils, of councillors having conversations with each other. Well, if I had a conflict of interest there, then you did over here, and almost threats to each other. Whereas in fact, if we're looking at good culture, a culture of disclosure is the most important thing. So anything that can shine sunlight on what might be potential conflicts and enable them to be dealt with is, I think, to be encouraged. Where are you on this, Chris?
Well, I get what you're saying, but and I'm not arguing against it, but I can just hear people listening to this, some people saying, that's all we need, another requirement, another reporting system. It's gotten complex enough as it is. How do we respond to that sort of, I guess, resistance for another task to undertake?
Chris, I think, I need to be clear on this. I think there's two parts to it. One is, I don't think reporting in advance is required. It's meeting our obligations at the time that we're involved in a decision needs to be reported. The more interesting question for me was, what happens after the event if someone has doubts as to whether there was a conflict of interest? How can we encourage those issues to be raised? Because ultimately you want the councillor group, the executive team to be talking about these things regularly, so the line between material and immaterial, for example, becomes much clearer.
Something worth thinking on, and as you say, Operation Sandon might give us some further material to mull over in the not too distant future. I know that's not too far off. What's the latest on Operation Watts, Steve?
I understood that, in fact, last week, Mr. Somyurek gave his evidence over nearly 4 days, and at the end of it said, whoo, or yay, or yippee, or something to that effect. Watts is resuming on the 26th of November, I recall.
Okay, some notes from around the sector. We want to recognise and I guess wish well Mark Dixon, the CEO at Wodonga, who has this week announced his resignation and is, as I understand it, leaving the sector.
Yeah, and good luck to Mark. I think there is a recurring theme that we've been raising, Chris, about the fact that a number of CEOs are, for a variety of reasons, leaving the sector. Yes. And at a time when we're talking about the Great Resignation, it becomes a really interesting one for local governments generally about how do we attract and retain high calibre people and keep them in the sector, because that sort of good people with experience are invaluable.
Couldn't agree more, and I think we've got to confront another elephant in the room, and that is a lot of second levels that are well recompensed for the job that they're doing, and need to be convinced why they would take that step up into what can be a politically charged and challenging environment for really not that much more reward.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. It's a live one.
And of course, Steve, councils are right in the middle or right at the end of getting their CEO employment and recruitment policies finalised. That's got to be done by the end of the year, I think.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting one, Chris, because those policies, whilst many might be at the kind of minimum standard, there is an opportunity within that process for councils to look at what their strategy is more globally. Where do they pay? How do they attract and retain at each level? What does succession planning look like? So it will be really interesting to see if any councils sort of go to that level about looking about their sort of interface with the market, I guess.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Hadn't thought of that. All right. Thanks, Steve. I want to go interstate just briefly and note the appointment of Sonia Cooper as the new CEO of Ipswich City Council, one of the biggest councils in the country, really. I don't think Queensland's got a great track record of having female CEOs, so I think this is a notable appointment, and Sonia's been acting in that role for a few months now, so congratulations to her.
Good stuff.
Back into Victoria, I want to note also and congratulate Mary Agostino at Mitchell Shire, the Director of Advocacy and Community, who has been inducted into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women this year.
Congratulations to Mary. That is a fabulous and well-deserved accolade.
Absolutely. One of only 23, and as far as I can see, the only council person on the list this year, but the list itself is now numbering in excess of 700 since it started in 2001. One perhaps for further discussion in a future episode, Steve, I just want to note that Greater Bendigo has ripped the Band-Aid off a pretty challenging issue this week and decided to introduce a cat curfew. Not an easy decision to make. I understand 80% supportive from the community for that decision, but I know a lot of councils are grappling with this particular issue at the moment.
Isn't it a tough one, Chris? That it always seems to get emotions inflamed, if you like. That at face value, the notion of, like, we know that domestic cats are predators, and when they're out at night, they predate. So, but for whatever reason, it causes a high level of angst in communities when councils go down this path. So, good luck to Benny on that. I've got no doubt they will have done some pretty good consultation leading up to it.
I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say, because it is public, the City of Whittlesea is currently considering that issue and going to be consulting the community next year more broadly on it, when it was raised as part of the domestic animal management plan, which is why a lot of councils are talking about this at the moment, because they've got to get their damps done. Very polarising issue. So good luck to Greater Bendigo. Congratulations on making the decision. It is a tough one to get to. Before we finish, Steve, I want to bring your attention to two stories, one from Australia, one from Italy, showing you a slightly different approach to what can be another challenging local government issue. Central Coast Council, unfortunately, is dealing with an issue where a woman parked her car, she claims legally, for some time during the pandemic, was in lockdown, hadn't left home, got a notice to say that her car had been seized as an abandoned vehicle, and that it would be destroyed. The only problem is it had been destroyed 2 days before she got the notice.
Oh, Chris, you're bringing back dim memories for me, having managed an area that included dealing with abandoned vehicles at an inner city municipality. This sort of thing can just happen with all of the best intent, and it goes back to having good quality systems and traceability and ensuring that things are done in the right order. And what do they say? If you're given a choice between a conspiracy and a stuff up, go with the second one.
People will lean towards conspiracy, but often it is the stuff up. There was a sticker on the vehicle, but I guess you've got to put that lens across it. There's a pandemic on. People are in lockdown. They're not going out to check the vehicle and see the sticker is there, which is an understandable response.
No, it was unfortunate. The vehicle was there, and they look at things like, is there, leaf litter around the windscreen wipers and under the car? Does it is it currently registered? A whole lot of sort of characteristics that might lead the authorised officer to draw the conclusion that the car is in fact abandoned. So it doesn't appear that it went awry at that point. They put a notice on the car. The car was still there sometime later. It was impounded. They sent the letter saying you've got a fortnight or a month or whatever it was, and then the car will be destroyed. And the car somehow found itself in another lane in the wreckers.
Well, and the letter was probably delayed because deliveries of mail at the moment are significantly impacted.
Actually, I hadn't thought that one through, Chris, and there's been a few issues like that. So maybe that's a good point about any sort of communication like that at the moment, giving some consideration to the fact that Australia Post are delayed and only delivering 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah. So some lessons, I think, there for all councils there, but for the grace of God, go I, as they say.
Absolutely. Can we go overseas now?
We can go overseas, because I just want to share you a similar story, but I can't imagine that it could ever happen here. I talked about this on the last edition of the podcast. There was a car parked on a street in the town of Conegliano in Italy in 1974. It has not been moved for 47 years until this month, effectively. So what's happened, Steve, is the owner, who's now 94, by the way, has parked the car outside his business, I think, hasn't had a need to use it, has left it there. It's become a tourist attraction. People take selfies with it. It's got its own marker on Google Maps. And because of that, it's become an impediment to traffic flow and pedestrian safety. So they've finally decided, the town's decided to move it. They've put it in a showroom. It's going to be restored and then returned and put in a garden opposite the owner's business as a tourist attraction. How about that?
Props to the people of Conegliano. Chris, that is fantastic.
So I don't think we could have a car stay in the same spot for 47 years in any council area in Australia much sooner, could you?
I think I could usually find a ratepayer who would do the civic-minded thing and alert the council as to its responsibilities, Chris.
Indeed. And on that note, I think we wrap it up. Thank you, Steve. Always good to chat.
Thanks, Chris. Same to you.
Never a shortage of things to talk about either on the governance update, and we'll have more for you next week. It's all brought to you with thanks from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers from VLGA Connect. Bye for now.